A decade ago, the footprints on this beach were those of a rebel army. Sierra Leone's civil war had been raging for 10 years. The rebels were well known for their brutality. The hacking off of limbs was their signature atrocity. At the time, I was here reporting the state of terror that had descended on Freetown. Its people were waiting for the rebel force, known as the Revolutionary United Front, or RUF, to attack. And then something remarkable and quite unexpected happened. Britain sent troops to evacuate British and other EU nationals. Their intention was to stay for 7 to 10 days, complete the evacuation and then get out, leaving Sierra Leone to its fate. But the force commander had other ideas.
I could see from my previous experience that actually a little bit of robustness and organisation might just be able to buy time for us to do something. And that was as early as the afternoon of that first day there. Are you prepared for this?
In fact, David Richards decided to take a risk. He decided to go well beyond his formal mandate of evacuation. His decisions would make Sierra Leone the second, after Kosovo, of what would come to be known as Blair's Wars. Sierra Leone would be an early experiment in the kind of liberal interventionism that would lead Britain one day into Afghanistan and Iraq. The British troops who landed here in May 2000 were in the vanguard of a new British approach to the use of force. When they landed here, their mission was very limited. Their job was to secure this airport and hold it for as long as it took to rescue the British and other foreign nationals living in Freetown and get them out of the country to safety, perhaps 7 to 10 days. But what no one foresaw was the transforming effect their presence here would have on the shape of the conflict. It was a remarkable thing to watch this country's fortunes turn around in the space of perhaps 48 hours. But what it meant was that those 800 British paratroopers found that, whether they liked it or not, they were suddenly responsible not just for the safety of the British, but for the fate of the entire country. Richmond Ndowu was at the airport when the British arrived.
The moment they arrived here, in fact, they were not talking to anybody, they were just taking their positions. They dug trenches, they made checkpoints.
And what did you think of that?
Well, to me, they came purposely to rescue the people of this country from the war.
The Sierra Leone public saw the British as their saviours. Richards responded to this. He ordered his men out into the countryside, many miles from the airport, to hold back the rebel forces. He went to see the beleaguered president, who was preparing to flee the country.
The first thing I saw was his helicopter parked, and I thought about his garden. It wasn't really a garden, but there was a helicopter parked beside his house, and I went in and said, "You won't need that, President Kaba, I promise you."
Brigadier Richards made the president a bold promise. Britain would supply arms and ammunition to the government forces. British helicopters would be made available to move men and materials around the battlefield. And he, Brigadier Richards, would take personal command of the war effort against the rebels, with a team of British officers. In other words, he was committing Britain to taking sides in Sierra Leone's civil war. So right from the very beginning, from that very first meeting, you understood that the British were going to supply you with logistical support, military advice, and arms and ammunition.
That's correct.
Did you think it was odd that the Defence Secretary in Britain informed Parliament that the purpose of the Paras coming to Freetown was simply to evacuate British citizens and other third country nationals?
No, that's not correct. That's not accurate.
So you were promising him that help before, really, you had the political authority to do it?
Yes, definitely, I'm afraid, yes.
For several days, the government in London continued to stress the limited nature of the mission. The politicians were still talking evacuation, not intervention.
in terms of constructing a tale for London, the military activities we needed to do to facilitate an evacuation operation were remarkably similar to what I was intending to do for a different purpose, which was to stop the RUF advance, because we had to do that to allow the evacuation.
So London was kitting you up for an evacuation, and you were using that kit actually to intervene in the Civil War?
Yes.
On the ground, we reported this at the time.
There is no longer any pretense here that this is just about evacuating British citizens. This is designed to reassure the people and warn the rebels.
Richards came under intense pressure from the Ministry of Defence to stick to his original mission, evacuation of foreign nationals only.
Trying to persuade the MOD sort of middle orders as much as not really the top level, who hadn't really focused on it in that first weekend, but those who were actually on duty, who were saying, Brigadier, you've got one job to do a NEO, we got non-combatant evacuation operation, and then get out. I needed to get to the next level up, and really to Tony Blair.
This process died with
to do that, Richards used us, the British reporters on the ground.
Everyone here now recognises that the only thing stopping this country sliding into the chaos of civil war is the British intervention. For like it or not, Britain has now assumed the leadership of the international presence here. Alan Little, BBC News, Freetown.
He briefed and briefed.
The risk is there, and if we were to get into combat by accident, I have the rules of engagement to allow us to respond very effectively indeed.
His aim was to persuade the government in London to back his more radical military intervention plan.
No, I haven't been standing up.
Tony Blair rarely gives interviews these days, but he was happy to talk to me about Sierra Leone. Even he joked off camera that there's still one place in the world where he remains wildly popular. One of the odd things for us there at the time was that the force commander, David Richards, now head of the army, was telling us quite explicitly what the mission was. It was quite involved. It was intervening in the Civil War. But Robin Cook and Jeff Hoon were standing up in Parliament and saying, our troops are only there to evacuate British citizens. And it'll only take 7 to 10 days. Why was there that?
Yeah, well, it was very difficult because we weren't sure. I mean, first of all, we weren't entirely sure what we were going to be getting into there. And actually, I remember having a discussion at the time with both, because I was up for intervening. I mean, I thought that if we ended up in a situation where the RUF actually took over Sierra Leone, it would be a disaster for the country. And there we were with the capacity.
So did the mission change after the British troops got there? Did they go in with a very limited mission? And
Yes. There was the initial mission was more limited, which is really just to deal with the British element, evacuate people and so on. But once we realised that we really could, by a targeted intervention with a limited number of troops who were prepared to stand up and fight if necessary, that we could in fact knock this gangster group out and restore the government, well, why not?
It didn't take long. Backed by the British, government forces pushed deep across the country. Though much of it was chaotic, they annihilated the rebels. Brigadier Richard's gamble paid off. Britain chalked it up as a successful exercise in the use of force, a just war.
You are going to fire 5 rounds rapid.
And 10 years on, the British, who came initially for 10 days, are still here, overseeing the training of the Sierra Leone armed forces. 10 years ago, these troops were fighting each other. Now, their own war over, they are training to be UN peacekeepers in other parts of Africa. This, too, is the legacy of the British intervention.
I would say that we've seen quite a remarkable improvement in our professionalism generally, in terms of training, discipline. You know, when I reflect back on what it was when everything was in chaos, it's quite a remarkable improvement.
So what's been built up here over the last 10 years is a culture of military discipline in a country where it had pretty much ceased to exist. And because the Sierra Leoneans themselves are now responsible for training their own people, it's a culture that's now self-sustaining. And what it means is that what's important about the British here is not so much what they do, but what their very presence has come to symbolise. That and what Sierra Leone came to represent in Britain's sense of what military intervention could achieve.
9. What is? 9 on target.
It came here just a year after NATO successfully intervened in Kosovo. Did these two experiences embolden Britain's leaders? Did they come to think of war not as a last resort, but as just another policy option?
Well, I think that inevitably is a little bit in that. You know, they were very successful, very worthy operations, and I think everyone felt rather good about them. But they weren't what Iraq and Afghanistan are, and I think that as military men and strategists and people in the Foreign Office, we didn't sort of just take stock and say, actually, there are significant differences here, and I hope that we will learn the lessons, which are many.
Now you move! Faster!
Britain's intervention in Sierra Leone worked. It ended the conflict. It restored democracy. And it's the story of how a military leader in the field saw a chance, took a risk, and in the space of a few days committed his country to a policy far more radical than anything it had intended.
Move